Wow, really full house. I wasn't looking back. I'm kind of flattered you guys all spent part of your evening coming to listen to my talk. Great to be here. I came from London. I've spent some time in Hamilton. I'm fond of the place. And it's really exciting to share some of the work that we've been doing in London with you guys here, because I understand there's people interested in similar things. My title slide, this is a picture of an ostrich fern in my yard. And I have a lot of really cool plants in my yard, but I chose this one because I think it kind of represents a lot of the topics I want to talk about today, and which include the benefits of naturalizing your yard. Ostrich ferns are sometimes called fiddleheads at certain times of the year because you can eat them. They're really delicious. I recommend cooking them first. When they grow in, they're a really great companion plant to have around trees because they provide kind of like a layer of mulch, if you want to call it that. They're cooling the soil by producing shade. They're really attractive to wildlife, and they're a native plant. So there's a lot of benefits packed into this one species, and I think ferns are frankly undervalued in a lot of our gardens. Thank you for the introduction. I won't repeat that, but I just want to emphasize that a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today, I'm speaking in first person as an individual, but this work is always carried out as part of a collective. I'm always working with other individuals who know more with me, who share their stories and put their trust in me. Environmental advocacy is a team sport. I work at the university at Western, but also with the city, with a variety of different nonprofit groups in the environmental sector. It's really a privilege and an exciting time to be doing the work. I also wanted to just add this here. So what I've done in my presentation is I talk about a lot of things, and I embedded hyperlinks in my slides because I might pique your interest. You go, oh, that's really neat. I want to learn about that. I know some people look at this and they go, that's not for me. I don't like QR codes. And maybe I've not convinced you that anything I'm going to share today is even worth saving. So I put this at the end of the presentation too. If QR codes aren't your thing, come talk to me afterwards. I'll get your information. I'm happy to send you my slides in an email. But this is just so you can fact check everything I say. So I wanted to, when I give a talk, I generally try to include a land acknowledgement at the beginning, and sometimes I get to travel and talk to folks in different places, and that's a cool opportunity for me to learn about treaties and the history of the different regions I'm visiting. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail since this was already talked about, but something that I think is relevant to what I want to discuss later is the content of the Between the Lakes Treaty. If you go back and read the treaty, it tells you exactly, what was exchanged back in 1784. And you can also read the language that was included. And a piece of language I see in different treaties throughout Ontario is referencing what exactly was included. Towards the bottom, it says, together with the woods, ways, paths, waters, water courses, and appurtenances, which is a word I don't hear often, to the said tract parcel of land belonging. And so this treaty is talking about everything that was on the land at the time that it was exchanged with the settlers. And I think about this and I wonder if the interpretation of it back in the day is different than what we ended up inheriting, which is that the landscape that we inherited doesn't look at all like it did back then. When this stuff was signed over to the settlers, I don't think they could have possibly imagined how much the landscape would change in just a couple of hundred years. And so I think this is really important to help situate the work that we're doing in the original cultural context of how we all came to be here. I also pulled up some interesting maps. This is showing, I believe, the Grand River and some of the earliest documentation of what the region looked like on paper. Of course, there was knowledge of the region's landscape dating back much earlier. This was a map produced in an 1821 survey. So, these are your early photos, maps, pictures of what Hamilton looked like. This one was drawn in 1859, and you can recognize the topography of Lake Ontario off in the distance, but it's pretty sparse, right? I mean, look, you've got almost agricultural land practically downtown, and it hasn't been that long when you think about it. When you reflect on, in just a couple hundred years, how much we have drastically altered the landscape all over Ontario, not just in Hamilton, but throughout southwestern Ontario in particular, our cities and our sprawl has really transformed everything that was here before. And so I think this is really important to think about when we're talking about naturalizing or renaturalizing. What was here before, right? What has changed? We know that one of the major reasons that biodiversity loss is accelerating is habitat destruction, that the naturalized landscapes that were here and are no longer here were really important to sustaining the biodiversity or the fauna and flora that existed for millennia before settlers arrived. And so I think this is, again, really important to consider when we're talking about naturalizing and what we can do as individuals with our own little pieces of land, as well as collectively when we're talking about influencing things like policies at a municipal level. We know also that, with the loss of habitat, we're seeing more and more species at risk. So those are species that could be extirpated or endangered in Canada, and they're concentrated along the southern part of the country, which is also where you have the most people living. So there's competing interests here for limited space. Our region has some of the greatest biodiversity in all of Canada. And I mentioned that there's a lot of species at risk. I would encourage you to read up on these. This has been mapped out quite extensively by groups like the Sierra Club, which look at the different habitats that have degraded, by how much they've degraded, and the species that are affected. And of course, something I think about a lot is the particular loss of wetland cover. We are far below what we need in terms of the bare minimum for healthy wetland cover to maintain our watershed. And that has real significant implications for the way that we grow our cities. It's got implications if you've got a basement on your home. Wetlands house a humongous portion of our region's biodiversity, and they are declining. They're still declining, even though we've already lost so much. I wrote a blog about this subject if you're interested to learn more by clicking the link. So what I want to talk about today is, given all of this negative doom and gloom stuff, why do we naturalize? Why do we take this seriously as something that we should do? And I'm not going to get into a ton of detail about which plants you should choose or how exactly you want to curate your particular property, because there's a lot of subjectivity there. There's room for your creative preferences. And there's also a lot of really good information out there online. And I can point you to some of those resources. I am not really an expert in naturalizing. I'll be honest. I'm kind of up here as feeling like an imposter. I'm an individual who took an interest in this space. I'm a young homeowner who had a yard of my own. I'm interested in the policy pieces, and I kind of went on a little adventure to figure out, how does this all work and how do we make the world a more biodiverse, wildlife-friendly place? And so I'm going to share my experiences today and talk about some of the benefits or co-benefits that in my dialogue with other people in community, I've come to appreciate can be really helpful in creating a narrative and sharing why this matters with other folks who might not be as excited about bees and birds and butterflies as anyone in this room. So when I talk about naturalizing, what I'm also discussing is the creation of what's become known as green infrastructure, which are forms of infrastructure that provide services or functions to where people live. And those pieces of infrastructure have a lot of good qualities associated with them. In particular, I think a lot about climate change in terms of adaptation and mitigation. So how many of you folks are familiar with what adaptation and mitigation are referring to? I don't want to be pedantic here. Okay, most of the hands are going up. That's good. Just quickly, some of the benefits for adaptation are that when you create more naturalized vegetated cover, that can help with cooling during overheating, extreme heat events like the heat waves we get in the summers now. It can provide shelter from wind or extreme weather and storms. It helps with flood mitigation because it's allowing water to infiltrate into the soil versus running off on top of pavement. And it also supports tree survival and propagation. I know that priorities in a lot of cities include planting more trees, and naturalization can play part of that. This is a map I pulled up of the parts of the city of Hamilton. This is showing surface temperatures. And as you can see, there's a lot of red on this map, which means it gets very hot in downtown parts of Hamilton. This is not showing the whole city, but you can see that even within this section, there are areas that are darker and there are areas that are a bit lighter. Those darker areas are sometimes called heat islands, and it's where you can end up with a lot of heat, radiation concentrating as a result of how conditions on the surface have been modified. This tends to be where you have a lot of pavement, where you've got a lot of tall buildings. Other factors can contribute as well. These are areas that pose risks to human health and safety, because in a heat wave, this is where your buildings are going to get the hottest and people can be at risk. And so this is where it makes a lot of good sense to be planting green infrastructure, trees that can provide shade and help with cooling and reduce your energy costs. I don't want to scare anybody in this room, but it's getting hot in here. We know that the number of days that we should expect to be really, really hot is increasing every year. And this is just some data I pulled up from climateatlas.ca showing the projected number of days increasing from 16 days per year to 37 days per year, where the temperature will be above 30 degrees. This poses a lot of challenges for society. It poses challenges for our existing older buildings. It poses challenges for human health and safety, like I talked about. We need to be using all of the tools in our arsenal to help mitigate this and the risks that it represents. And I showed you a map of heat islands. This is another heat map, but instead it's showing the distance to the nearest park space. And you can see that is also not uniform across the city. There are areas shown in red or orange where you don't have access to green space, particularly in the industrial lands. I'm not sure about Hamilton specifically, but in general, this tends to track with other socioeconomic factors. More lower income families tend to live in neighborhoods that have reduced access to green space. And so this is also an equity issue. The areas where people are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change are areas where there tend to be fewer trees, less access to nature, and so forth. So I talked a little bit about the adaptation. The climate is warming. How do we deal with that? There's also the mitigation component. So how do we turn off the tap and reduce the contributing factors that are causing climate change and global warming? A lot of the equipment that we use for mowing is gas powered. And so if you think about it, that is an extra maintenance cost, an externalized cost that includes increasing emissions. The other thing is when we think about naturalizing, those landscaping techniques often include trees. And trees, as they mature, can sequester a ton of carbon dioxide. And so tree health is linked to the soil quality growing around the tree. And that soil quality is linked to everything else that's growing on that landscape. The natural vegetation that's occurring under the base of the tree can impact the survivability of the tree. Some of the other benefits of naturalizing briefly include food security, biodiversity, improvements to water quality, spiritual, mental, and physical health for people living in these spaces, cultural identity, place and belonging, and equity, which I mentioned earlier. So these are not very pretty slides to look at. I'm excited now because I'm getting to the pictures part. This is just an overview of some of the themes I wanted to convey, why naturalizing matters to me and probably matters to some of you, because I think this is part of the narrative in normalizing this. Let's talk about food security. These are pictures that I took over the last few years of my experiences in nature, in particular in my yard and in yards in my neighborhood. You can source a lot of food from nature. Not just plants, even fungi. This is a morel mushroom that grew on my campus. They grow in the same patch every year, and I include them in my pasta dinners. On the left, you can see a native raspberry plant. If you look closely, there's a nice spider blending in there, really well camouflaged. Some fiddleheads that I showed on my intro slide, and an invasive species called garlic mustard, which was brought over here because it has really good qualities that make it tasty. This is now a pretty problematic weed that spreads into natural areas. You can eat it. If you see it in your yard, pick the leaves, they're delicious. I'm a big fan of foraging for nuts. Can anybody identify any of these nuts? Do they look familiar? Yes, what do you think? That's right. They're real messy to process, by the way. You gotta be careful.
Is that a beech nut?
That's right, yeah, beech nuts at the top. We've got shagbark hickory nuts, we've got black walnuts. These grow all over the city of London, and a lot of these are street trees. And if you time it right, you can show up and find exactly when these drop from the sky, and you can get a nice set of plant protein for free. This is sumac growing in my backyard, Saghorn sumac, one of my favorites. This was before the birds got to the berries. This is so pretty. It's a really nice understory plant. Lots of really rich textures. It actually served as inspiration for a sumac-themed beer that we had produced in London a couple of years ago, which had a really nice color and flavor. Sumac has been used by Indigenous peoples for a really long time. You can use it in tea. You can use it as a spice for seasoning. So what are the other benefits of naturalizing is the wildlife. These are photos I've taken in London. These were all taken in people's yards. This brings me so much joy. And I think about the benefits that people experienced during COVID when we were going into the woods and we were using our natural spaces more. What are people doing in those areas? What is so exciting about going for a walk in your local park? For me, it's, you get to see the deer and the birds. And these are just photos of mammals that occur in southwestern Ontario, right in our city alongside us. Behind your house, there could be animals living, in my case, under my shed, or just passing through, eating my plantings. But this is so enriching, and it means that our little space that we take up is shared with other forms of life. Not just mammals, of course, we've got rich herps in southwestern Ontario, lots of reptiles and amphibians. These are, again, just photos I've taken over the last few years. I didn't know anything about this stuff, by the way. When I moved to London from Toronto, I was like a suburbs kid. I didn't really have access to any of this until I moved to what we call the Forest City, and I started taking an interest in what was growing in my neighborhood. These are my ferns I showed you before, the fiddlehead. There's a nice little house I've made, and sadly, I've not yet had any toads show up in my backyard. Every day I go out there and I check because I want there to be a toad house, but I have fences around my property, so I don't know if it will ever materialize. I do see chipmunks hiding in here during the rain, though. And so I just put this here to mention that it's quite important to provide shelter for the wildlife that you're inviting. I started to notice some really interesting insect interactions in my backyard. Does anybody know what this insect is called? So it is a type of katydid. I think it's called a greater anglewing. And what I learned was I had been seeing these around my property. And then one day I came across a stick that had these perfectly laid scales on it. And I wondered, like, what the heck is this? I've never seen anything like it. And so I posted this on iNaturalist, an app that I really like using for identifying plants and insects. And somebody commented that this is exactly how this type of bug lays its eggs. It will find a branch and lay them in like a sequence like that. I just thought it was really remarkable. I learned about the relationship, the mutualist relationship that peonies have with ants. This is not a native plant, and I'm not really a native plant Puritan. I do have some ornamental non-native plants. But I learned that the ants will climb up and eat from the flower bud, and in exchange, it protects the plant from other more harmful insects that could bore into its flesh. I've had peonies in my garden since I was a kid, and I never paid attention to this until I started a garden of my own. And of course, the butterflies. Oh my God, the butterflies. Butterflies are lucky. People really seem to like them. They often get more credit than moths do, even though I think moths are really cool for themselves. I've had the experience of welcoming a wide variety of butterflies to my yard since I started planting more native species. These are butterflies that are just sort of basking in the sun. That's a morning cloak butterfly. I've noticed that they really like landing on my backyard composter for some reason, maybe because it gets warm. And I've started to appreciate that there are many species of insect, including butterflies, that have these host specialist relationships with certain types of plants. Probably the most famous one is this type of caterpillar, which you'll probably recognize as the monarch butterfly. And its host plant is the milkweed plant, the one you see on the right. This has become a symbol of these kinds of insect-plant relationships, and people are very aware of the monarch butterfly and the importance of its conservation. This is a photo taken just in front of my house. I've learned a lot about the relationships between plants and insects because of this book. And I brought it in case anyone wants to peruse. The author of this book is actually in the audience, which is very exciting. So one thing I like about this book is if you go through its pages, it lists individual plants and the specific relationships they have with different species of insect. And this has really opened my eyes to the complexity of the relationships in my backyard. And so it really helps me when I'm going out there on safari with my coffee in the morning to see like what's growing back there today. I bring this book with me, and it helps to contextualize everything I find. And so this has made a world of difference. I've lent this to so many people, and I bring it with me to these kinds of presentations so that you can take a look at it and peruse. Yeah, strongly recommend. I think an underrated type of insect, people look at this and they get kind of heebie-jeebies. These are predatory insects. So these are insects that show up in your yard when there are other insects for them to eat. And when I found these in my yard, I was like flattered. I was like, oh, they know there's habitat here. There's a whole food chain. On the right is a robber fly. You can see it's chewing on it. And I think the left is a bald-faced hornet, if I recall correctly. And you can see the little ocelli, the little like beady eye things in the middle of its face. This just landed on my back porch one day while I was sitting back there. I had never seen something like that before. Of course, we have other predators. Does anybody know what type of raptor this is? So this is actually, as far as I know, a Cooper's. I originally thought it was a sharp-shinned hawk. I get these mixed up all the time. Kind of embarrassing because I'm a bird person. That mourning dove had been feeding in my yard for a number of weeks. And while I was sad to see it become someone's dinner, this again was a compliment. It told me that there is habitat back here, that there's functioning ecosystem stuff going on back there, which was riveting to watch from my back porch. So I want to talk a little bit about bird feeding, since we're on the subject of birds. Bird feeding is a beloved pastime. I think birds enjoy a lot of the benefits that people feed them, but also care about them more than the wasp or hornet or anything like that, which I think should still be a priority for conservation management. And when we plant native species, we are providing food for birds in all seasons. This is a cedar waxwing, and this is a bird that's known for really having a diet that's primarily based in fruit. They're frugivorous. They sometimes even get drunk from eating too many fermented berries in the winter, which I've seen. And so this is a way to feed birds without relying on a bird feeder that comes with certain risks. I used to feed birds like this in my backyard. And I started to notice that if I didn't maintain the bird feeder, that the birds would start to look for food in other parts of the yard. And so I started leaving all of my seed heads. When my plants would grow and snow would fall, you could see the dead flowers. They're not really dead, but the tissues were still there. And the birds would go looking there for food. And sometimes they would even be flipping under the snow and finding grubs that they could eat. I've since taken down my bird feeder. I don't feed birds anymore in this way, but my yard is busier with birds than it ever has been. I just wanted to include this slide for reference because I think if you choose to feed birds at home, and that's an okay thing to do in my opinion, there's some things you should know. You need to make sure your feeders are cleaned regularly because otherwise all these birds are eating from the same fork. And if one bird is sick, all the birds can become sick. The seed also needs to be replaced because it can get moldy. The other thing is if you start feeding birds in the winter, do not stop. Because you may have birds in your neighborhood that are dependent on that food source. And if they're caught in a bind where the weather gets really cold and suddenly the restaurant is closed inexplicably, it could cause them some hardship. So just keep in mind, if you are feeding birds, there's certain nuances and responsibilities to remember. I've noticed though that since I started naturalizing, I see birds feeding in my yard in different ways. And of course, over 90% of terrestrial bird species depend on insects in their diet, especially when they're rearing their young, because insects provide a lot of protein. This is a family of northern flickers that was hanging around in my backyard. They're a type of woodpecker. And despite the name, they spend a lot of time on the ground, pecking into the soil. They seem to really like ants. This is a woodpecker feeding its mate. Feeding its young while its mate watches. Their antics have just been so hilarious to watch. And I enjoy looking out for them in the morning. You'll also find that if you plant native species that eat insects, that provide food for insects, you will have birds coming to your yard that don't necessarily visit feeders. Like the eastern bluebird, for example, is a bird that will forage for insects, but doesn't usually come to bird feeders. I'm not sure how this slide ended up here. It's in the wrong place. Interesting. Okay, well, you know what? I'm going to back step for a minute. Or you know what? I'm going to come back to this in a moment. I was talking about planting trees earlier, and that's when those slides should have appeared, but there was a bit of a snafu. When these birds are eating seeds from these flower heads and from trees like acorns, they're scattering them everywhere. And so it's really important to recognize the services that those birds are providing when they're coexisting in our urban environment. Why I'm talking about that is in Hamilton, you guys have a strategy focused on tree planting. And I took an interest in this in preparing this talk and went and kind of poked around and looked at the math. And by my calculations, you guys need to plant about 5,212,000 trees to meet your target of 40% canopy cover by 2050. The city wants to plant 25,000 trees per year. And if you crunch that, it means you're only going to end up with about 14% of the plantings that you need to reach your target. I'm not here to criticize or cause any panic. I think this maybe deserves a little more scrutiny. My point is the birds can help. The birds are already planting seeds out there. And so if we protect them and we create habitat for them, that can help in achieving some of these other objectives that have implications for climate change adaptation. Before I was talking about tree survival, this is a very sorry looking tree in our downtown core that has a really tiny soil cell underneath, probably not long for this world. And what I think is really beneficial about having natural cover around the base of the tree is it helps with retaining moisture. If you mulch a tree, it provides the same effect. But this tree on my front lawn, I water it, and that layer of tall grass and other native plants growing around it helps to keep the soil cool and moist, which is beneficial for the tree and improves its odds of surviving. This is a map we have for London, Ontario, where I live, which shows the urban heat island effect. And this map where you see the areas that are really dark, that is also where we have the least vegetation. So there is a pretty clear correlation there that planting can help. Okay, so what I really want to talk to you about is my adventures with naturalizing my yard. Talked about some of the fun I've been having. However, when I started this, I was warned I was looking for trouble. And in fact, I went looking for it on purpose because naturalizing is contentious. It shouldn't be for all the reasons we've already shared. But we are coming up against some cultural practices and norms that clash. There's a bit of tension with going for a more natural wild look and welcoming wildlife back to our city. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story and experiences there. I started with this book. I started growing different kinds of trees in my backyard. I've experimented with pawpaw trees and have given away a couple hundred of them, which is a lot of fun. I select my plants from the Native Plant Database. If you're not familiar with this, it's offered by the US Department of Agriculture. The link is here. Again, sorry, the slide was supposed to appear earlier. You can type in the name of any plant and it will show you its native range map. This is not the only authoritative source for this kind of information. This is just the one that I prefer to use. But this will help you to identify if the plant you're thinking about putting in your garden is actually native to your region or introduced. Okay, so in my backyard, I started with a little patch. I had 2 sheds, and I thought, you know what? I'm worried that this is going to spread. Let's start small, and I'm going to plant some stuff in between the 2 sheds. And this is what it looked like in the first year. There's some native stuff. There's some non-native stuff. There's, I think that's motherwort in the corner. That's non-native, but it does have certain beneficial properties. I said, you know what? That's okay. We're going to combine and mix, and that's fine. There's enough for the bees. There's enough for everybody else. So I started with this small patch. I was hooked. I was fascinated. This was such a busy part of my yard compared to the rest, which was mostly grass. And so this was like my early beginning, my foray, and starting with a small patch and growing from there. And it was around the time I was doing this work that I learned about a story that was unfolding elsewhere in London where I live, involving a poor woman who, like me, had started a small pollinator garden, and it got chopped down by the city. And people were outraged. They were wondering, how the heck did this happen? This poor woman, who I think was kind of traumatized by the experience, was planting milkweed because she cared about the monarch butterfly. And her garden, I mean, if you look at what was there, wasn't causing anybody real problems. Like what that represented was not a clear health or safety issue, but nonetheless, this garden was subject to a complaint. And bylaw enforcement for the city followed up and acted on the complaint while this woman was on vacation, no less. She didn't even know. She came back and her garden was gone and she had a fine. So I took an interest in this. I thought, that's weird. You know, we're the forest city. We have all of these commitments to nature and the environment and our strategic plan. How did this happen? So I went looking and I read up on our bylaw. We have something called the Yard and Lot Maintenance Bylaw. Hamilton has a similar bylaw. There's other ones that interact like property standards. But anyways, this bylaw is what usually is resulting in these kinds of enforcement actions. And on the website for the city, it says some common violations that we see include, and the number one on that list, grass and weeds over 20 centimeters or 8 inches in height. So I thought, oh, that's not good. My grass is a lot taller than 8 inches. What does that mean? So I started digging into the bylaw a little more and reading about the definitions. And a lot of these struck me as kind of weird. So for example, if you wanted to grow a perennial garden or a wildflower meadow of native plants, you actually had to get an exemption for the bylaw. It meant that what you were doing is illegal, but they're going to let you get away with it. It's still illegal, but you have an exemption. So the rules don't apply just to your yard. Okay, that's fine. You need to clear your yard. So that means you have to remove weeds and grass, which by the way, are not defined anywhere, and keep everything to below 8 inches in height. I don't think I included it here, but they mentioned that you have to keep the yard clear of waste, and waste includes fallen leaves. So in the fall, if you don't rake your leaves, technically speaking, you've broken the law. So anyway, I thought, wow, that's real something. I'd like to find out when the last time is that the city took a look at this bylaw. I also wanted to mention that in the bylaw, they talk about under wildflower meadows and perennial gardens that you need to comply with the Weed Control Act. And that's an important piece of legislation to know about if you're naturalizing, because that is at the provincial level. And there are species that are listed as noxious weeds that are prohibited, not by your city, but by the provincial government. And so this is the list of 25 species. I don't know if it's been updated since then. I don't believe so, which are prohibited. None of these were in that poor woman's garden. None of these were in my garden. But anyways, this is the closest thing to a definition of weeds that I could. So I mentioned at the beginning, I'm on an advisory committee to the City of London. It's focused on environmental stewardship and climate action. Our mandate includes a bunch of stuff I'm not going to read because my talk's already too long. But I would say that this squarely falls in the mandate of thinking about adaptation to climate change. And so I brought forward some questions through my advisory committee. I'm the chair of the committee. I'd like to know, why did this woman's pollinator garden get chopped down? Why do we have this policy? Does this make sense given other factors? And I got this response back from staff. So they said, well, because this is a pecuniary interest, it's a legal matter involving a specific property, we can't talk about that. Sorry, it's confidential information. However, we've looked at the bylaw and we think it's great. It's fine. Nothing needs to change. The reason that we have it is that we need to keep people safe. For example, if a young child is walking along the sidewalk, there's a buffer that needs to be mowed so if the child leaves the sidewalk, they don't immediately get lost. Yeah.
All right.
So I'm like, that's fine. Okay, sure. I can't argue with that. I wasn't done with it. I was still really curious. Like, how did this woman's garden get chopped down? They're not going to tell me about her specific garden. That's fine. Pecuniary interest, whatever. So I set a trap. This is my front yard. I had been mowing it up until that point. I thought, you know what? Let's see. If they won't talk to me about that woman's yard, then surely they'll talk to me about my own yard. You can see my tape measure. I made sure I was violating the bylaw. And so I set it up and I waited. And I joked with my partner. I'm like, you can tell, like, there's going to be so many kids lost in there. Like, we're not going to know what to do with them all. So anyway, as you can see, this is mostly just grass. And it had started as a turfgrass lawn. What I found really interesting is when I started to let the grass grow, I found that there was a bunch of other native plants actually already there that had been mowed over and over again, but were coming through finally. I had milkweed, I had fleabane, I had some other interesting plants that were present all along. So I kept going. I dug a hole. And before you start this, by the way, just caveat, don't dig a hole without doing a locate request. Just double check where your utilities are. I did. I didn't make a mistake, but just it's important to note. I dug a hole, and what I did was I created a rain garden because I'm in an area of the city that is very vulnerable to flooding. And if you look around, there's a lot of pavement, a lot of turf lawn. And so here's where we hired somebody to come and drop off rocks and gravel. I dug my hole a few feet deep. I filled the base with rocks. I covered it with a nice mix of soil and compost. I ordered plants online, which, by the way, is amazing. I never knew that you can order plants in the mail, like how far we've come. They come in this nice box. All of them survived and did great. There's my partner and my grandmother planting in the rain garden. These are all species that really do well with moist soil. And this is sort of what it looked like towards the end. So you can see there's kind of a little hose into the part of the garden that we planted. That hose is fed right from my roof. I've got rain barrels on either side that collect rainwater, which reduces my costs of maintaining it. An important note about this is if you install a rain garden with a rain barrel, just be careful that there's an overflow on these barrels directed away from your building foundation. They don't give you instructions with the rain barrel when you buy it. I noticed this the first time we had heavy rain, and I was like, oh, I'm going to need another barrel. So I added another one that directed away. And in chatting with stormwater staff at the city, they said, you know, Brendon, we deal with this all the time. Just make sure that you plan for the really, really heavy rain because these have a finite capacity. And of course, disconnect them in the winter. The greatest part about all this is I didn't pay for any of it. The city paid for it. There was a rain garden pilot program funded by the city through the London Environmental Network. I applied, explained I'm an environmental educator. They gave me $1,000. So I got to use that towards the cost of materials. We did the labor mostly ourselves. So anyways, I naturalized my yard in a way that broke the bylaw, but that the city paid for. Meanwhile, I was doing stuff in my backyard. So I showed you before the little patch in between the two sheds. You can only see one of them here. Originally, it was all kind of grass. I planted a little apple tree. There's a sumac. And as I let it grow in, again, we started to see native plants that were already present that we weren't aware of. And over time, this has really grown into a nice, lush understory. This is a few years later. Really pleased with the progress that we're making. I put these cages over my plantings. This is a tip I learned from someone in my community. They're just from wire laundry baskets. This really helps. You can see the critters that go after my plantings. The left picture on the left is a common hop tree, which is a nice Carolinian species. And so, lo and behold, my trap was successful. And one day, I was on a Zoom call and my partner came and said, oh my God, Brendon, it finally happened. And they showed me. I got one of these on my door. And it says, it's not really clear, please clear all grass and weeds exceeding 8 inches in height. And they gave me a couple weeks to. And so I spoke to the bylaw officer. Apparently, someone, when they complained, saw my wire baskets and they said it was garbage. Okay. So I became so enamored with this bylaw infarction. I thought, all grass and weeds. I don't see anywhere where it says grass and weeds. And I've checked on the website. Doesn't really tell me what that is. This is Indian grass in the left photo. This is a species that grows taller than me before it produces seeds as part of its natural life cycle. I've got goldfinches that really like to eat them. This is common milkweed. Weed is in the name, and you can see there's a little butterfly egg on the base of the leaf, maybe even an endangered species. Is that a weed? I'm not sure. So I went to City Hall and I brought my ticket. And when I started asking questions, they said, you know what? Thank you very much. Your yard is exempt. You have an exemption. You go about your business. It's fine. And I wasn't really looking for an exemption. I was looking to understand if that woman's garden got chopped down and my garden got a ticket, what is the problem? And so we started a campaign, and I worked with a group in London called Climate Action London. We appealed to other people in the city who wanted to naturalize their yard or were already in progress. Hey, city council, we don't understand this bylaw. Help us understand. Let's make this make sense and make it work for all of us. And this letter that we wrote collected over 200 signatures. We submitted it to the Committee of Civic Works that was receiving the request from my advisory committee. Hey, can we take a look at this? I included a video. I'm not going to play it in the interest of time. It's just me on the news being silly. But this caused quite a fuss. And in the video, I talk about how I had people throw garbage at me while I was gardening in my front yard. I don't know who actually complained to the city about this, but it caused quite a stir. And so this became a rather polarized debate. I enjoyed the video so much because the broadcaster said it was a turf war at City Hall. Yeah, here it is. Here are some of the comments that were left on this article which had a picture of me in my front yard holding this notice. People were not happy. I was kind of surprised, like the vitriol that came out, people accusing me of being lazy. I assure you, none of this was a matter of being lazy. But people have these attitudes about what a natural garden represents. So we proposed through my advisory committee to have a review done of this bylaw. Now, in addition to doing another review, we wanted to bring in community members so that we could hold a public participation meeting and hear about like what issues is this actually causing in our community. I prepared a whole background report. I'm not going to go into all the details. All this information is online if you're curious to learn about the context for it. One thing I will mention, and we brought this to the attention of the city, is the relevant legal precedents, the case laws, because this is not actually a new issue. This has been tried over and over again in different jurisdictions across the province. Some of the notable cases are listed here. I'm not going to go through all of these details, but what's important to know from these precedents are, one, your naturalized yard is covered by the guarantee to freedom of expression under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And a municipality cannot exceed the authority that it has through the Municipal Act to enforce health and safety requirements to regulate the aesthetics or the appearance or the visual look of your yard. All municipalities are really supposed to be doing with their bylaws is regulating the health and safety considerations. And that can include things like sightline conflicts, noxious weeds. There are important concerns there that need to be accounted for, but not aesthetics. One of these cases is shown here, Sandy Bell's garden in 1994. This was tried by the Ontario Court of Justice, and she won that case against the city of Toronto, who said that her garden was excessively too. I mean, okay, sure. So I brought all this to the attention of our city council because I'm like, hey, by the way, I'm not going to sue you, but if I was going to, this is exactly how I would do it. And now this is on the public record. So anyone in the city who has a future bylaw complaint brought against them should have the legal tools to understand what is and is not within the city's jurisdiction. And this did not go well. When I brought this to Civic Works, actually, it failed. We asked for a public participation meeting and a comprehensive review. They said, no, we just reviewed it. We don't need to do that. We don't want to do a public participation meeting. We don't want to do a jurisdictional scan, blah, blah, blah. It failed. What did pass, though, is they said, we understand that the community is concerned. We want to develop better education, information to put out there so it's easier for people to follow the rules. Not just the folks like me who receive a complaint, but the people who are maybe thinking about lodging a complaint. Before you call the city, here's what you need to know. So if you don't like the look of that yard, I'm sorry, sir, that's too bad. Like you need to document a health and safety issue, and you need to provide certain documentation like photos and an explanation of the problem. So this passed, and since then we've been developing these recommendations for education. What's interesting though is for these things that we asked for that failed, all of this has happened anyway. We just didn't get a yes. So this bylaw is being reviewed. In fact, there's going to be a public meeting about it just next week to talk about what's in the next iteration. I found the junior staff person that was working on the bylaw amendment. And I said, hey, what do you think about, his name's Ethan Ling. What do you think about these recommendations we produced? He said, you're totally right. This bylaw is archaic. It's outdated. We need to like update these things in a way that makes sense and aligns with the legal frameworks, but also the other strategic goals of the city. So anyway, that's all to say, it was a big fuss for nothing. We were told this is not going to happen. And then, it was happening behind closed doors. I think maybe I kind of caught them with their pants down, but. So lessons learned in London from my advocacy experience. Sometimes you need to take a roundabout way to where you want to go. If you show up at City Hall and advocate for something, odds are you're not going to get your way the first time. Sometimes these things have to happen over and over. People need to hear it again and again. This is how you drive social change. And sometimes to get where you want to go, you have to go a roundabout route, like seeking out the actual staff that are working on what you're asking for. The yard and lot bylaw, which is what this was filed under, is subject to a really high volume of complaints. So staff deal with a lot of this, but your city councilor does not want to hear from more people complaining about the state of their neighbor's yard. There's garbage over there, mosquitoes, it's endless. And they get thousands of complaints like this. When I asked for a public meeting, they were like, no, Because if we start talking about, the naturalization piece, we're gonna have folks coming out of the woodwork and talking about everything, and we don't want to go there. So just something to keep in mind. When I asked for data from the city, how is this bylaw being enforced? Like, how many people actually get these tickets for naturalizing? It says that that's one of the most common complaints. That data doesn't really exist. They don't keep track of it. They don't want to say that in public, but that's what I found out. And the risk of a legal challenge. So those court precedents that I shared, I don't think the city's legal counsel really cares. I think their impression is let's let sleeping dogs lie. And you're not really going to sue us. Like, you're not actually going to go to court because we'll just give you an exemption and it will be fine. So in advocating for this work, there's a bit of, politicking involved in understanding the points of view of the people that you're trying to convince. In making change happen, it is so important that you have allies in decision-making roles. I want to give credit to these two. These are two city councilors who I work with. Sam Troso, when I was campaigning for all this on Twitter, he went around his ward and he took pictures with all the boulevard gardens and he's like, is this illegal? Is this illegal? He's a law professor. And Councillor Skylar Frank is the former director of the London Environmental Network who issued me the grant for the rain garden. So yeah, it's all in the family here. I want to point you to this resource, which is phenomenal. This is produced by a group based at Toronto Metropolitan University, led by Dr. Nina Marie Lister, who incidentally supervised Ethan, who is updating the bylaw in London. This has everything you need to get started on doing this kind of advocacy. So like I said before, you can access my slides and visit the link. All of the case summaries that I talked about are here. Deputations, letters that have been submitted to City Council about these kinds of conflicts. It's all there. So I want to wrap up my talk, hopefully briefly, by talking a little bit about my lessons learned and how we change culture. How do we make people actually want this and desire naturalized yards? This is a photo taken of a garden on my university campus at Western. This was not here when I started a few years ago. This was a product of community advocacy and volunteers and our Friends of the Garden Club coming together, sourcing the plants, working on it. And this has been such a positive boon to sustainability on campus. It also means that all the thousands of people who come to Western, they interact with this, they see how great it is, and they take that knowledge with them back into the world. And for that reason, I think educational institutions like schools and university campuses are really great vehicles for inspiring people to adopt these kinds of changes. I think for a municipality like London or by Hamilton, it's important that they follow the golden rule. And that is treat others as you yourself would want to be treated. That means if you're going to impose requirements or policies or regulations on private landowners to do certain things, you should also be doing those things on public land in your facilities and leading by example. So for instance, Hamilton's already doing this. You guys already have your Bee City framework for pollinators. There's projects that have been supported by the municipality. That's great. This means that if you're trying to influence things happening in the private sector, Hamilton is leading by example. I would also say that naturalizing is linked to a lot of things that Hamilton has already committed to being important. If you look at the city's strategic plan and the council priorities for 2022 to 2026, reducing the burden on residential taxpayers while planting trees helps with that in a lot of ways. Facilitating the growth of key sectors, accelerating our response to climate change, protecting green space and waterways. What we've been talking about all this time is compatible with things that City Council has already committed to through their strategic plan. And so if you can frame the asks within that framework, it helps a lot. You also have a bylaw in Hamilton that I think is deserving of a bit more scrutiny. I was just at City Hall talking to some councillors and staff, and my impression is that no one is getting sued in Hamilton for this because they're probably getting exemptions. If you're complaining about your naturalized yard, getting a ticket, you'll probably be fine. Nonetheless, if you read this, it does say, like, if you're within the urban growth boundary, you got to keep everything capped to 21 centimeters. So if you go back to those maps I showed you earlier about the distance to park space and where the heat islands are, those are not properties that are protected. Like, they're not along a water course. They're not next to a natural feature. They're in a dense neighborhood where actually the vegetation is most badly needed. And yet this bylaw says that that should not be afforded the same protection if that vegetation were beside a natural existing area. So something to think about. When I visited City Hall to talk about this, I brought seed balls. And I want to emphasize this because I think if you're trying to connect with people who don't necessarily agree with you or value the same things, you can reach out to them through their shared experiences. Who doesn't want butterflies in their garden? Right? If you give people this, you say, you know, just chuck it somewhere and watch it grow. I bet it will bring them joy and they might come around. So I left these little boxes on the desks for every single member of council and for all of the senior staff attending the meeting. It was well received. An example of leading the golden rule, we have our multi-year budget ongoing in London. I don't think you have a similar process in Hamilton, but something I'm really excited about is we have a program coming up to naturalize boulevard gardens. So that means we're going to be mowing less parts of the city along boulevards and restoring those and planting more native vegetation and designing this in a way that achieves all those other co-benefits we talked about. So this is leadership. This is the city saying on public land, we're going to prioritize creating more natural spaces. We're also doing this in parks where we're trying to reduce mowing. This is a way to normalize this in people's everyday experiences of the city, and it makes naturalizing in your own space more acceptable. So I think about how I could have prevented this. Of course, I don't know who complained to me about me to the city, but if I had been a bit more proactive, could I have avoided this whole situation, which, to be honest, I engineered, so maybe that wasn't the best example. But anyway, if you're trying to avoid getting in trouble, how would you do that? Number one, I think we are living in a point in our culture where we really need to get back to talking to our neighbors more. How many of you know the names of the people who live on either side of you? Can you raise your hand? Oh, very good. I need to move to Hamilton. It's not like that in London. I think especially if you live in single detached homes, people are quite disconnected from each other. And so if you're thinking about naturalizing, as a courtesy, talk to your neighbors. Find out if they have any concerns. Find out if there's certain sensitive areas they want you to avoid, like maybe planting next to their driveway. That can help a lot. Planting in clusters can help too. So if you're like me, I planted species all over the place willy-nilly. I think it's beautiful. It's a meadow. But if you clump species together like this, it provides the impression of intentionality. Someone is going in here and maintaining it. They want it to look this specific way. That can help to ward off scrutiny. You don't have to naturalize your whole yard at once. You can start with phases like what I did. Start with a small section and maybe expand. And let your neighbors know you're not coming for their lawn. If they want to continue to have a lawn, that's okay, right? Your little patch of nature will be over here and their patch can be over there. Install a path through the garden. That helps. I often hear concerns from community. Oh, there's going to be ticks in there. I'm going to get bitten by mosquitoes. If you clear an area, it makes it seem intentional. I also put up a little fence around so as to let people know where not to walk and trample my plants. It is generally a good idea to clear the buffer, especially along a right of way. I've seen this done well. I've seen this done poorly. You can actually design the landscaping within the buffer to minimize the need for maintenance like mowing. This is a boulevard example from Kingston. Examples include sidewalks, roads, and also your neighbor's driveways running along the sides of the property. If you plant species in the buffer that don't grow tall, you'll never really need to maintain it. So I planted pussy toes. These are Parlin's pussy toes and woodland strawberries. These are native plants. They don't grow more than a couple inches tall and they spread really nicely. In a couple years, I'm going to have a nice thick carpet. How do you encourage naturalization in your community? We're talking about organizing a garden contest. So this is an example from the city of Toronto, where every year they recognize gardens that have done really well in different categories. Some are more manicured. This is an environmental pollinator habitat garden that was recognized in 2022. I got a sign from the city. So my illegal garden is actually labeled with the city's logo. This is our mascot filter fill. And I think providing a sign lends a certain legitimacy, like, oh, this is on purpose. And you can also use the signs for providing more information. There's a program by Canadian Wildlife Federation where you can actually have your yard certified as wildlife habitat. This link will take you to the application form. And from there, you can print a certificate. You can also order a sign on a plaque that you can mount in your yard, or you can make your own. I really like interpretive signs. These are not necessarily great for your average residential property, but I think these are really important components of parks. Because when you put in infrastructure like this rain garden or low impact development or bioswales, you need to explain to people what it is. And so this is an example of one that was produced by the city in London, and it provides really great neighborhood education. I think we need more art in signage and messaging. It doesn't just need to be info. This is a rain garden. This is what it does. We actually need to share feelings about nature and what this represents, not just, need to know information. This is a poem from a sign in a natural area where I live. I'm going to read it briefly. I am the heat of your hearth on cold winter nights, the shade screening you from the summer sun, and my fruits are the refreshing droughts, quenching your thirst as you journey on. I'm the beam that holds your house, the board of your table, the bed on which you lie, and the timber that builds your boat. I'm the handle of your hoe, the door of your homestead, the wood of your cradle, and the shell of your coffin. As you pass me by, listen to my prayer and harmony note. Does this make you feel something? It gives me goosebumps. If we had more of this stuff in parks, I think people would care more. I have a theory. This is a little program that I'm developing in London. I really like iNaturalist. You guys know what iNaturalist is? Okay, good. I don't have to explain it. It's really easy to make iNaturalist information accessible to even people who don't use it. So for example, this is a QR code printed on a sign. And if you were to scan it, it would pull up in reverse chronological order all of the observations within an area on the map in recent time. So for instance, you could post one of these on a tree or in a garden, and you could show people everything that you've documented in that space. For example, here's my yard. And if you were to scan my little sign in the QR code, you would immediately see all of the different wildlife that occurs in my yard. Again, I think this is a great addition for yards, but also for park space. For example, this is where we are. So you can just open iNaturalist and draw a circle or a square, generate a hyperlink to that map, copy and paste it into a QR code generator, and bam, you've got an instant updated list of what people are observing in that part of the map. Here's just what's around. This is a sign in front of my yard. We've got bird-friendly city signs. I love this because people stop and they look at it and then they ask me about birds, but it's not just about naturalizing, it's explaining that the person who lives here is taking action to take care of birds. People really like birds. And we give these signs away into communities. So I think if you're going to roll out a sign program, come up with a creative way that these can be distributed as well. We organize a lot of plant exchanges, seed exchanges. I have learned so much from being part of this community of people in London who've received complaints like mine, who come up with their own strategies. Many of the plants in my yard, I did not pay for. They came from the community, which is, I think, really special. And of course, people give plants away in their yards, which always inspires me. I'm looking at the time and I just want to try and keep this brief. I added a note here because I think when you're creating habitat by drawing wildlife to your yard, you also have to recognize you are assuming responsibility for what happens to that wildlife while it's there. And there's a lot of threats that are caused intentionally or not by what we do with our space. Here's an example of a garden in an urban environment that could be quite dangerous for wildlife if they were to visit. I started to think about this in the context of robins that laid their eggs on my house last spring. I don't know if you've ever been through this. It's like heartwarming. It was like the highlight every day of going in and checking on the babies. They started really small. They got bigger. They eat so much. And then before you know it, they were fledged. And as soon as they fledged, I'm like, oh my God, where's the baby? Like, is it safe? Like, well, there's so many things that could harm it. I found it in my yard, but I started to think about what are all of the hazards that this bird could encounter? Well, of course, if you have a pet cat or a dog and you let it run around outside without a leash, you're introducing risk. These are natural predators. I don't blame cats or dogs for being what they are, but your pets should probably be leashed or at least supervised while they're outside and contained. Don't let them just run around the city amok. I've had some experience trapping cats in my yard. It's not fun. I don't recommend it. In London, we have a program where if you actually take these to a facility, they will reunite them with the owner of the cat and issue them a lesson learned, hopefully. I developed a little system for when a cat visits my yard, I will attract it with some tuna. I'll put a collar around its neck. You can tell I love QR codes. And when it goes home, it's got a little message in the bottle. And when the person who owns the cat scans the QR code, there's a lovely anonymous note, very neighborly. Importantly, this does not talk about birds whatsoever. It's about the cat's safety. It's about what the owner cares about. Like, did you know your cat can get hit by a car or eaten by a dog or a host of other things? If my pet came home wearing something that somebody I don't know put on it, I'd be pretty alarmed and reconsider my choices. And I mean, I don't know how well this works on the whole, but I anecdotally have found this particular cat, I put one of these collars on and sent it home afterwards. Doesn't roam around anymore. And by the way, I've made this letter and QR code tool available online for free on our website. So if you visit, you can print your own. If you ever have a cat visiting your yard that's problematic, you can make your little message in a bottle. We also have education for owners of new cats. So we printed these pamphlets that go out to veterinarian clinics and adoption agencies. And it's all about why you should train your cat to wear a leash before it grows up. Just like you would train a puppy, you wouldn't try training an adult dog that had never seen a leash before to start walking on a leash. You train them when they're young. Cat owners don't often have access to that information. So education. This is a really great example of a vet clinic that's prioritizing birds. You can see they've got their nice plants that are attracting wildlife, and they've treated their windows as well. And on that note, treating windows. So this is what I study for my PhD. I haven't talked about it. There are very simple ways you can make windows safer for birds. A lot of people believe that birds crashing into windows is a problem for tall buildings. That's not true. In fact, most of the time birds are hitting windows, they're crashing into windows on homes and low-rise buildings, which are much more common on the landscape. If you're attracting birds to your yard with native plants, consider treating your glass. And when I say treating your glass, oh, here's just a graph showing a breakdown of approximately how many birds are killed by different types of structures. Again, high-rise buildings are only a tiny part of it. There are a variety of ways you can treat your windows. I recommend visiting flap.org for that information. A spoiler is don't use these little stickers. If you're going to use these stickers, like the birds of prey in the bottom corner, you're going to need to cover your entire window with them. And if you want to do that, that's fine. But putting one or two stickers up on the window doesn't help because birds are very good at dodging obstacles. So if you just put one or two of those, the bird is just going to fly in between them or fly around them. And what you're going to see is the bird's just going to hit that tree part of the glass. So here's a window with a few stickers, and there's a smudge from a bird that smacked the untreated part. So marker spacing is important. Anything you put on the glass should not be more than 5 centimeters apart. I brought a product that works really well. You can come talk to me about it afterwards if you're curious. Window wells. This bird is stuck. There are a lot of little traps like this around buildings that wildlife gets stuck in. It's not just window wells, it's stairwells, it's open-topped pipes. Try and imagine what it's like to be a really tiny animal and look around for places that they could get stuck and seal those places wherever possible. This is an unfortunate robin I found that had been struck by a vehicle near my home. Not something I can do much about, except I put out signs and I printed a bunch. Community, our Wildlife Rehabilitation Center often receives animals struck by vehicles. They will provide these to homeowners so that if they're in a high-risk area where there's habitat, there's a reduced risk over time. And then, of course, cleaning up litter. I think since COVID, we've seen a resurgence in a lot of litter problems, especially stringy litter like masks, ribbons from balloons drive me nuts. These are threats that happen all the time without us even noticing. If you see litter in your yard or in any natural area, please do pick it up. It doesn't take that much effort. Putting out a source of drinking water. This is a bigger lure for birds, I find, than bird feeders, especially when it's hot. I started with just a little pail of water with a rock in it as a perch, really popular. I installed a fountain since then. This is like the busiest spot in town. My neighbors have bird feeders. The birds don't want that. They want the water. And I think it's the sound of the running water that attracts them in particular. Don't use sticky traps outside, folks. Pest management is an important aspect of dealing with invasive species. These should not be outside. I wouldn't use these anywhere, to be honest. Even in your house, they can cause problems for other animals. This is a poor woodpecker that got stuck on a tree in Byron in London. And lastly, I have been doing an education about rodenticide or rat poison. This is super prevalent. If you walk around most buildings like the one we're in, you'll find black boxes on the ground. Those are leaking poison into the environment because the rodents that eat the bait with the poison wander somewhere else. they get sick or they die, and they get eaten by something that then also gets poisoned. And over time, this bioaccumulates. A single owl, for example, can eat thousands of rodents every year, and a lot of those could have poison in them. And so there's alternatives. You can look around the perimeter of your home, check for where rodents are getting in, deal with what is attracting rodents in the first place. Lots of good information on our website if you want to learn more. So I want to wrap up by just overall synthesizing some of the recommendations. You mostly live in Hamilton, I imagine. So what of this information could be useful for you? I think is a personal journey for each of you. I would say where possible, pay attention to what's happening in your city in terms of policies that are already underway. The urban forest strategy is one. You guys are developing a biodiversity action plan. These are critical junctures to get a word in that can have ripple effects through other policies like bylaws. Address barriers that are faced by individuals and groups that want to do the right thing. So if you decide that your bylaw needs to be updated, maybe that's something inhibiting more people from naturalizing. That's a barrier that could be addressed. Find your allies on council. You guys are lucky. You have a pretty progressive council with environmentalists on it. I think you'll know who to talk to, and they will be a great asset for you. And consider the maps, like the heat island in the distance to parks. That's really important for the equity lens and for climate change adaptation. So I promised I'd put this up here again. If you missed it before, you can scan. Otherwise, come talk to me. I'll send you my slides at the end. I went a little over time, so I want to thank you all for being patient and hearing me out. This has been a really exciting journey for me, and I'm happy to be here sharing it with you.
Before we get into the Q&A too, I forgot to mention earlier, get in the way of QR code. Where's Sheila? Sheila, you're still? Sheila graciously brought some leftover native seeds from Seed Saturday. So if you didn't see them on the table when you came in, go talk to Sheila afterward if you want to pick up some seeds to start your own little garden paradise. So thanks for bringing those, Sheila. I appreciate that. But if you guys have some questions, I don't know if there's any online. Lou, do we have anything?
Yeah, there's one. Somebody would like to get the information on the window treatments.
Yeah. If you come and talk to me at the end, I'm happy to provide it to you. Is it online? So I would suggest visiting flap.org. That's a really great resource. There's a lot of good information there. I'm not sure what their specific needs are, but they can probably find it at that website.
Any questions from the audience?
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have any experience on sort of the opposite end of discouraging people from planting actual like invasive plants? I'm a McMaster University student. Our campus gardens are full of Japanese barberry and things like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't talk much about it. I think it depends who is doing the planting. If you're dealing with like a group like a university, which it sounds like you are, the people you would probably want to talk to are the ones who work in facilities, and they might have a list of approved plantings for campus, species that are, to be selected. I would try and obtain that and look at it and compare it with known invasive plants. And if you identify that there are conflicts, that there are species that we really shouldn't be planting anymore, I would find the body at the university that's most likely to be sympathetic. For you, I think that would be the Council on Naturalized Lands at McMaster, which is an advisory committee to the president. And I think those are legitimate concerns. If you're dealing with individuals planting the wrong stuff, I think a big gap right now in regulations is we need better information at points of sale. It's not that we need to outlaw the sales of all species. It's that before you buy something like English ivy or barberry, you need to be provided with the information about where it is and is not appropriate to plant that, and that you can't just dispose of it by chucking it into the woods. Currently, very few retailers actually provide that information, but the information exists. There's Grow Me Instead guides. There's a lot of good resources out there. I think those things could be implemented through business licensing requirements, but that's another bylaw discussion. Did you have a question?
In response to your invasive question and your comment about availability at retail, encourage everybody to visit the CCIPR website's Canadian Coalition for Invasive Plant Regulation. They're doing fabulous work. It started here in Hamilton. And that's exactly what they're working on, is preventing the horticulture industry from continuing its nefarious ways.
Yeah, it's really challenging also because now native planting has become popular and there's no regulations about what you can label as native. So you can label a cultivar that was imported from the United States and is not wild type as a native plant and buy it at Loblaws. So yeah, I'm hoping we'll see some policy developments in that front in the next few years. Yeah, did you have a question?
Had like map Ontario and showed that plant was specifically native to Ontario. Is there places where you can find a specific area that's native to Ontario?
Yes, that information does exist. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. So I had showed a map, which was from the US plant database, which was like all of Canada and which provinces different plants are native to, different species. The question was, can you find out within Ontario, are there plants that are, can you find information about which plants are native to which regions within Ontario? Yes, those resources absolutely do exist. I'm kind of drawing a blank of the name of the website that offers them, but it's definitely out there. You would probably have an answer.
Oh, for this region, a very reliable authority is Michael Oldham's list of Carolyn plants. It's actually drills down to the county level. Absolutely amazing. The preamble is worth reading too. Also, the forest gene preservation. Conservation. Yeah, highly underused website. They have great lists for trees and shrubs by ecoregion. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Those two sources. Forest gene conservation.
Forest Gene Conservation Association. Yes.
Another online question for the bylaw challenge in London. How did you find weeds in your proposal to change?
Great question. So I think we struggled with that a little bit. There's a balance to be struck with, I would say, competing priorities and listing species as weeds. For example, there are some species that could be listed as a weed, but have cultural significance for Indigenous peoples. So how do you regulate that? There are some species identified as weeds that are really agricultural weeds and issues, like you wouldn't see them in an urban environment typically. What we recommended to the city was, here's a list of species that the city of Toronto has identified as problematic weeds. This is a starting point, but you should develop another list of specific species that are outlawed as weeds and justify why that particular species should be identified as such. And there are some that I think will be no-brainers, like by far the worst we have in London are things like garlic mustard and European buckthorn. But if there are others that are a little bit more complicated, then I think, yeah, it's deserving of further study. We didn't want to be too prescriptive because that's, I think, work that should be undertaken by the city ecologist. Any other questions? Yes.
Been naturalizing the lawn, but how would you mitigate the impact of parking, like driveways and stuff? Have you explored that at all yet?
So I don't have a paved driveway. It's permeable. It's just gravel. I find that helps. Generally, the water infiltrates better than my neighbors' driveways. There is a program in London, and I think it operates elsewhere, called Deep Pave Paradise, where we work with a private landowner to remove concrete or asphalt and replace it with native plants and improve infiltration of stormwater. So it is happening in small spurts, but no, it's not something I've spent a lot of time on. I need to work on my upper body strength first. Any other questions? Yes. You know, that's a good question. I would guess yes. Yeah. I don't like giving Jeff Bezos money, but I did buy a bulk pack of collars on Amazon. You can buy like 50 packs of them. I would say an important consideration is I use the collars that are safety release clasps, because if I'm putting one on a cat, I don't know for certain if it's a pet or someone's feral cat. I also don't know, sorry, I don't know if it's someone's pet or a feral cat, and I don't know where that cat is going next. I would hate to put something on an animal that could cause it harm, like if it were to get tangled. So with these, if you just tug on it, it comes right off. Yes,
You custom design that thing that QR code goes in?
the tag.
Yeah.
Okay, those I ordered like from Amazon as well, but yeah, I just printed off the QR code, regular printer paper, cut it up, stick it in the tags, and you're good to go. Each one costs me like maybe 70 cents. Anyways, if you have any more questions, I'll stick around after so you can come find me. I also have this book if you want to check it out. And I can talk about window collisions if you have questions.